What's going on, everybody? Mortem here. This time bringing you my review after 100% for Hades 2. Sequel, of course, to Hades, and both of which were very well received roguelike ARPGs, with this one just having released out of early access towards the end of last year in 2025. But before we dive into all that fully, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though, in the case of this particular game, a couple of other things to note. This is not a terribly difficult game to 100% in terms of its achievements, thanks to the addition of God mode, or the carrying forth of God mode, I should say, which we'll talk about in the difficulty section more. But generally, it just makes the game easier, and the only thing besides that the achievements don't really cover is the very high fear levels. So Hades 1 and 2 have a sort of in-game system that allows you to add a bunch of modifiers to the runs. And while the game does reward some of the lower levels of that system with various things like cosmetics, to achievements even, however, the higher levels of it do not actually have an in-game reward, and their primary purpose is, of course, just the challenge associated with doing them. I want to make it clear that I am not claiming to have done the highest levels of that system. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, for the original Hades, someone actually doing a full run with maxed out heat took several years from the time of the game's release. So I just wanted to make it clear that I did not do that, and I was happy to use God mode to speed things up after a couple of successful runs. Moving on, however, probably obvious, but I did not receive a review key for this. It launched in full, mind you, back towards the very end of September in 2025, and it launched in early access a good bit before that. I purchased the game during its early access period, towards the very beginning of it actually, and simply finally got around to playing through the full release as I was trying to wrap up everything from 2025 here in January of 2026. To that end, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about here is almost certainly something you may consider a spoiler to some degree, both visually and otherwise, just the stuff that I actually want to talk about. And so, if that is a concern to you, you may just want to either not listen or skip to the conclusion, something to that effect, whatever floats your boat. But otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into this and talk about the game proper. Hades 2 is, on one hand, a really fun game mechanically in much the same way that Hades 1 was. While it is very fun and overall an enjoyable experience if you're into ARPGs or roguelikes generally, I do have to say, having played the original Hades, if I were to offer one large piece of criticism for this game, it would be that it doesn't really feel like a sequel so much as a sidestep. Much of the game remains exactly the same, and the stuff that was changed is just different, rather than say something that feels genuinely better or improved. For instance, some of the different weapon types in the game that provide different playstyles for Melanoi. But that's just kind of it. They're different playstyles, but not necessarily better, really. And that's kind of the theme of the entirety of the game itself, which I think is, again, probably the biggest thing to know going into this one. From there, let's talk about the technical state of this game. So this game ran flawlessly for me. I did not have any trouble at all with it. No crashes, frame rate dips, anything like that. Relatively simple game in terms of hardware, what's going on, that kind of thing, but genuinely zero issues. Haven't seen anybody else really report any issues, so you're more than likely going to be okay on that front. And that's actually going to come up a little bit later in the Steam Deck section to be sure, but just to reiterate, no issues. From there, let's go ahead and talk difficulty. So, difficulty is technically set, but there is an optional God mode. You either play the game's regular difficulty, or you have a God mode on, which is kind of sort of a difficulty slider if you get down into it. So what God mode actually does is provides you an instantaneous 20% damage reduction. However, after you die, that goes up by 2% up to the maximum cap of 80% damage reduction. However, you can actually choose to adjust that maximum, so if, say, 80% is too easy for you, you could set the maximum to something lower than that, while still giving yourself a boost, and sort of in that way, the game has a variable difficulty, sort of. That said, the only thing that God mode actually affects in the game, outside of obviously just the damage you take, is simply that I believe it groups you into a different category for run completions. Other than that, absolutely no different from the regular version, and After I beat the game a couple of times, I was happy to turn on God mode to sort of speed through seeing the rest of the content, as the game, via its roguelike nature, is very repetitive, of course, and tracking down various conversations and resources to see the rest of the game was going to be a bit of an endeavor otherwise. Now, I will say, for me, and this honestly might just be me getting a little older, I guess, it does get to a point, especially in the later areas, where it can be a little hard to parse what is going on screen because there are so many different overlapping effects from you and all of the different enemies on the screen, which can make it very difficult to dodge the attacks you need to dodge to not die, and obviously God mode will help you with that by just making sure you don't take a lot of damage from those attacks that are difficult to get out of the way of, as an example. So even if that's the kind of thing that bothers you, you've got some options. Moving on a bit to the story and my thoughts on it. Again, while the story is not terribly complicated, if you are trying to experience it organically, this is probably something you'll want to go ahead and skip. But where Hades 2 is absolutely a sequel is in its story and the delivery of that story, because our new main character, Melanoi, is the princess of the underworld in Greek mythology. So this following on from us playing Zagreus, who was also the prince of the underworld in Hades 1, except this time around we come in when Melanoi has already reached maturity after being raised by Hecate. This is because it was sort of forced on them after Kronos came back and basically put the entire underworld into stasis outside of a few people who managed to escape, such as Hecate, you, and a few others. And Kronos has since been waging a war against the Titans, trying to, of course, make up for the fact that he was attacked by his own kids later on, and that's kind of the story. Your goal is to stop time, or more specifically, the Titan of time, Kronos. As the name would probably almost certainly imply, though, that is not as necessarily easy as it may initially seem, and so after a couple of successful runs in the underworld, you're likely to make arrangements up to the surface where, after completing successful runs for both, you'll eventually find a way to permanently put an end to Kronos and this situation, which leads to, I've gotta say, honestly, a pretty disappointing ending. The story is not so complicated or in-depth enough to be something I would be like super invested in to begin with, but the ending honestly just didn't sit right with me, and then after you get to the ending, you can actually continue to play and try to reach the epilogue. And given that I've already mentioned a spoiler warning, basically the epilogue sees you trying to track down what happened to the Fates. They ran into some trouble as part of this entire thing and ultimately went missing, and the epilogue, after you deal with time, basically comes down to doing some more stuff to try to track down the Fates themselves. This giving you an epilogue and, of course, kind of what happens in their version of the Greek mythology here in the long term, which pretty much wraps up the story, and everything that happens in between there is the conversations you have with all the various gods and titans, and the bonds you build with them along the way, which is one of the things people really enjoy about this game. That, truth be told, doesn't matter much to me personally, but as you encounter these various gods and their various forms and the like, and even a few other beings along the way, you can often offer them gifts and stuff, and then after certain conversations, you can even deepen these bonds and continue to offer them gifts or invite them to places, that kind of stuff. And on that front, there is an impressive amount of dialogue and responsiveness in terms of like what you're doing on your individual runs and what all these characters have to say and the like. Though if you've played Hades 1, you kind of get the gist already. So overall, the story was decent. The ending was a bit of a bummer, but it was interesting to get there. They definitely did a good job of making Kronos in particular very smug and annoying, which makes it satisfying to find a way to actually deal with him in the moment, that is to say full term, but then you get to the ending and it's a bit of a bummer because of that at the same time. So there is that, I suppose. So let's go ahead and move on to things like the game's various progression systems, of which there are many, both permanent progression, per run progression, longer term stuff like the cosmetics you can unlock for the Crossroads, which acts as your hub. But let's go ahead and talk about the bulk of it. So some of the big systems are Arcana, Keepsakes, weapons and their aspects, incantations, which often provide permanent upgrades as well, and prophecies, which often give you great rewards. So starting from the top there, you've got your Arcana. These are basically like tarot cards that you'll unlock and increase your ability to use. You can't ever use all of them, but they provide a bunch of bonuses before you actually even head into a run, and this can include things like the ability to alter the RNG, have extra health, various other benefits, things like that. Not only can you unlock them to begin with, but later on you can actually use another resource to upgrade them to be even more effective. This, in addition to your keepsakes and your weapons and aspects and stuff, sort of define your build before you even go into a run. Then you've got your keepsakes. As you start making connections and developing relationships with various characters, when you initially give them a gift, they will give you, usually, a keepsake back. Keepsakes are essentially items you can equip and then change out during certain sections of a run, and these also have a variety of different effects. Some of them just offer generally useful things like reducing boss health or giving you certain bonuses. The ones from the gods, or the people who give you your boons typically in the runs, will often guarantee you a boon from that character, and then you can also improve the quality of it. And so keepsakes are kind of one of the many ways in which you can affect the game's RNG via these items, though you never actually have full control over it, mind you. These keepsakes are just very useful for doing that, and then quite a few of them are actually involved in various quests, I guess you could call them, in order to get certain conversations and fulfill prophecies and whatnot. The other aspect being your weapons and aspects. One of the things you'll be spending your resources on is unlocking the various weapons, but really that's just the start, because then you'll also be able to unlock the ability to change them via aspects. These being just slightly different versions of the weapon that perform a little bit differently, and so unlocking those weapons and the various forms they inevitably come with, there being 4 for each ultimately, gives you potentially quite a few different ways to actually play through the game. Now, kind of hand in hand with that though is the incantations. These are basically big spells you'll cast at the cauldron at the cost of various resources. These are often permanent upgrades, not only for you, but also to the way things happen on your runs. For instance, the ability to swap out a keepsake in between regions is unlocked this way, and it's how you'll do basically every major thing, including plot progression, by finding resources and then casting these incantations. It will upgrade the crossroads substantially, that kind of thing. The incantations are very important in terms of permanent progression as well. One of the things you'll unlock in doing that, though, is actually your prophecies. Prophecies are from the fates themselves and things you can affect simply by doing them, and they often come with a reward, which can be a very convenient way to get the resources to do other things. Like, for instance, you'll be picking up bones a lot, and one of the things you can unlock via incantations is a broker who can sell you stuff as the game goes on, and those are often at the cost of bones. Later on, you'll be able to turn your resources that you no longer need, and there are a lot of different resources, into currency as well, called kudos, which you can then use to cosmetically upgrade the place. So, long story short, there is a lot of progression that is gated behind the resources that you'll be gaining on the various runs that you partake in, but then there's also the progression on those runs themselves. This is basically how you build out your actual build, in addition to things like your arcana, the weapons, and the stuff you start the run with. Essentially, you'll run into various boons or other rewards for clearing an individual area. These boons then have all sorts of different effects that stack and interact with each other, and the weapons and stuff you've chosen that then, of course, alter your playstyle, which we'll talk more about momentarily. And then there's also other upgrades outside of your boons, like, of course, the actual resources you have to gather up, special events, that sort of thing, and that's all on a per run basis. And things like the gold you make on a run, as an example, are only useful for that run, so there's no reason to hang on to it, and you should spend it pretty liberally. This can also then be further enhanced by the vows system. There is a bit of progression to that, of course, in terms of actually making the game harder via its added fear, but it can also change like entire boss fights, that kind of stuff. Long story short, there is a lot of different progression gated behind a lot of different things, and while for the most part that feels rewarding for what it is, I will say there are occasionally pain points. A couple of examples, for instance, is that in order to unlock some of the weapon aspects, you need a significant amount of resources from some of the later game areas. However, the game is divided up between the underworld and the surface world, and sometimes you need resources from the underworld's last area, and then you need resources from the surface's last area, and it can be incredibly tedious to go grind that stuff in a way that kind of feels like the resource cost versus the reward you get for paying it are just not on par with each other. And if I was to criticize anything about the progression of this game, that would definitely be the part of it I do. Moving on a bit to the gameplay and the world structure. Now this goes a little bit hand in hand with combat. I just kind of want to set up some basics of how this works. So essentially we start every night at the crossroads. This includes various iterations of people that that come and go that you can talk to and potentially progress your relationship with. As an example, you kind of get all that progression and resource spending done before you can head out to the sort of training area, get your initial build planned, and then either head to the underworld or the surface. Now, you'll start out by going into the underworld every time. Eventually, through progression and the like, you'll be able to unlock the surface area, which you can't initially survive on, and then after doing a little more progression, you learn how to survive on, which then fully unlocks runs for both the underworld and the surface respectively, which each have their different enemies, regions, that kind of thing. And while that is great just straight away, and terms of like variety and stuff, which is something the first game could certainly lack, they do unfortunately make it a little bit annoying with that resource problem that I just mentioned, where certain resources only spawn in one place or another, and having to track them down on entirely separate runs, and some of these things actually need a significant amount of those resources. It can be annoying potentially. But they also do just function a little bit differently. As I said, the surface world will initially just kill you outright, but then once you've overcome that, there's different encounters up there, different bosses, and then there's also mechanical differences to the region themselves. Like the first city area of the surface world has you picking and choosing from all the different rooms you can potentially see, and once you've cleared a certain amount of them, you head on to the boss. The next area after that, the Rift of Thessaly, I think it is, you'll be jumping around on various ships that are sailing through this rift, and it kind of functions a bit differently again. The third area of the underworld, called the Fields of Morning, sees you actively running around much larger field areas that spawn encounters in based on the rewards you're trying to claim, as an example. And then the final area of the underworld, which uses like a little numeral countdown system to try to reach time, of course, based on like the number of rooms you have to clear from there. But basically, each run, surface or underworld, consists of 4 different regions with a boss at the end of each one, generally known as a guardian. Completing all of these, that is to say beating all of these bosses with the various roguelike things you pick up along the way, consists of a successful run, which will either advance the plot or simply, kind of give you the success screen after you finish the game, and you'll get special resources, etc., to again make some meta progression via relationships, resources, etc., as you try and try again, gaining more control over the RNG, etc., as you tag along. But that's the sort of basic structure of the game, and now let's talk a little bit about combat. Now, ultimately, with the weapons and their aspects, there are like 24 different ones, so I'm not going to sit here and explain the differences between each individual weapon. And so we're going to talk about this in slightly more general terms because that's a little easier for me. Basically, combat comes down to some basics, which then get modified by the game's various boons and things from the different gods. So you've got your basic attack, your special attack, your casts, your dashes, your dodges, and then your omega abilities. So something that makes Melanoi kind of unique here is that she can augment her regular, special, and like cast attacks via spending her mana pool. This allows them to be the omega versions of those things, which often have different effects. And there are certain aspects that play around with this more than others, with them having like special abilities and things based on like what you cast, how you cast it, that kind of thing, or what you spend mana on the omega forms of, that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of variance just straight away with the basics before we even start talking about the boons and things. So typically speaking, your boons will either affect one of those categories individually, altering it how it works, and then being capped by just being able to do that once per like god or whatever their ability is. And then you have more general boons that are, of course, simply going to affect other things. Like an interesting one is once you've met Hera, you can start unlocking her boons, which one of them will actually like increase the rarity of the boons you get and increase its level at the same time. Because by finding more and more boons typically, or one of those special circumstances like with Hera I just mentioned, you can increase the level of these boons at the same time, making them more effective, but you also have to factor in their rarity on top of that. They range from common all the way up to heroic typically, and are obviously much more effective the higher you go. This gets a little more complicated with duo and legendary boons. Each deity that you pick up boons from, for the most part, has a legendary ability which is like insanely strong. They typically only come into play in the later half of the runs because you typically have to get a lot of these boons in order to unlock other potential roles for them. And then certain combinations of boons from various deities will lead to a duo boon between the two, which typically sees their abilities interacting in some way based on what you do. And as hopefully became clear just from that description, two things are true at the same time. This is essentially what Hades 1 did, yes, with some slight changes to sort of simply represent the fact that we're playing Melanoy here, but also that it provides a lot of variety in what you do, but more than likely, the more you play, you're going to come across certain weapons or aspects you actually enjoy messing around with and the sort of way they feel to play, and then certain types of boons you actually enjoy. So for instance, for the most part, I really enjoyed Zeus's abilities, especially when you combined him with Hera. One of their sort of duo boons actually forces you to drop all the boons from one or the other while also giving you a significant boost to their boons, which I thought was really funny, and also a very fun and effective way to play the game potentially, at least in terms of how I liked to play it, mind you. But then there's also just other stuff you might discover that's fun, like mixing Hephaestus with Hestia is a kind of neat way, and to make that a little bit farther, one of the other things you can do are the Chaos Trials. So, the being Chaos, being the primordial ancestor of everyone here, basically, through various progression, eventually gives you access to this black stone, which allows you to undertake various Chaos Trials. Chaos Trials basically either provide you with a set loadout or a completely random one, which I actually wound up really enjoying because it lets you try out like different build combinations and iterations of things that you might not have necessarily thought of on your own, which come in the form of either like set trials, yes, but then once you have actually unlocked all of the weapons and aspects, more than likely towards the very end of your time with the game, you'll unlock the Great Chaos Above and Below Trials, which are like a fully random loadout on your part to clear a run with you only having control of the boons you find on the run, while also activating up to level 20 Fear via the Vows, which is the other thing we have to mention, of course, that I mentioned a little bit earlier. There are the Vows. These are just modifiers you can tack on to enemies and just sort of change how things work, including entirely revamped versions of the boss fights, which are much harder if the regular stuff isn't doing it for you. And so to that end, between the Vows, the modifiers, the trials, the difficulty modifiers via things like God mode, etc., this game can be either as relatively easy or as painfully difficult as you would like to make it. And that is one of these things that I think this game does really, really well, and that Hades 1 also did really well, that makes it so fun from a gameplay standpoint. But what, again, was a bit of a surprise to me even was just how much I wound up enjoying the Chaos Trials specifically, oftentimes because it forces you to do things you might not have necessarily thought of on your own and try out like different loadouts and stuff. Had a lot of fun running through those, kind of more so than the rest of the game, actually, even though I was having a pretty good time for all of it. Which then brings us to the Steam Deck section. So, much like the technical state of this game runs pretty flawlessly on the Steam Deck. In fact, it runs so well there that if you missed it, this game actually won Steam's 2025 Best Game on the Steam Deck award. So unsurprisingly, it is in fact verified there. It's got all the things you want. Controller support, cloud saves, all that usual stuff. It plays extremely well on the Steam Deck. It honestly kind of feels like a kind of game that might be made for a handheld portable system like that, allowing you to play these short burst runs or trials basically anywhere as a pretty decent way to kill an awkward amount of time, as an example. So it's a fantastic game to play in that portable fashion. But that does bring us to our positives and negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, the expanded variety, for sure. Hades 1 was a bit limited. You were ultimately running through the same 4 areas over and over again, and while I actually spent more time with Hades 1 overall, it did have less variety overall, and I appreciate them trying to expand upon that with things like, say, the 2 different versions of the runs you could go on. And with that expanded variety, the feel of the gameplay honestly retains that really fun overall quality. And while they've certainly made some changes even in that respect, in many ways I would consider Hades 2 maybe a little more deliberate as opposed to very, very fast in Hades 1, you can kind of get to that point. It just requires a little more deliberate getting to that point in Hades 2, if that makes sense. The actual gameplay of it still feels really great, which is, I think, one of the best things the game has going for it. But unfortunately, there are a couple of negatives here, for me at least. As I mentioned, probably the biggest one by far is that the game really does feel more like a sidestep than a proper sequel to me. I enjoyed it, I had a lot of fun with it, but it mostly just feels like I played Hades 1 again with different weapons and a different story overall. There's the frustration on some of the resources and where they're located and how much of them you need and how many runs you're going to have to do in different underworld versus surface type of stuff. It can just be kind of annoying to collect those things sometimes. sometimes in a way that doesn't make me happy, I guess would be the way to put it. On top of that, the ending was a bit of a bummer for me personally. Not the epilogue, but rather the ending with Kronos and stuff. I was like, oh, that's kind of disappointing after all the work we put in, to be honest. Especially since it doesn't really feel like they even leaned into it for the epilogue, at least in my opinion. But ultimately, that brings me to my conclusion for Hades 2. So, Hades 2 is very good. I had a lot of fun playing it. Unsurprisingly, a lot of other people have as well since its launch towards the end of September last year. But it also just doesn't feel like a sequel. The good news there is that Hades 1 was also a really great game. And if you enjoyed that, you'll more than likely enjoy this with its very similar but slightly different ways to approach things like combat, etc. That one gripe aside, though, I would absolutely recommend it. It is $30 US over on Steam, and I think it's a very fun game for a reasonable price. And that is where we're going to leave this particular review. So certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.